What's going on, guys? How's everybody doing? I know what you're all thinking, and yes, I do have stain on my shirt. This is an oil stain on my shirt. I know that you were all thinking it. Today, we're going to be talking about names in the Bible and how just the names in the Bible can point towards, as strong evidence towards biblical reliability, historical reliability, um, of the Gospels specifically. So when we're reading scripture, often we gloss over the names that we read. I mean, not really gloss over. Obviously, we know who did what, but some of these names repeat, and some of them are impossible to pronounce, and that's about all we think about it. Um, and I think probably rightly so, because you could take all of the names in scripture and change them to something else, and the story would be the same. Nothing would change. The gospel would still be the same. Good news would still be the same. But these names point to the historical reliability of Scripture more than we might think. So the naming pattern in Scripture needs to be aligned with the exact names that existed um, at that time and place, which I'll go into in a second. Sorry, my stuff that I wrote down is over here, so I'm just looking over here to look at it. Um, so the naming patterns need to align with the actual names during that time period, or else there are um, seeds of doubt that are sowed, and thoughts of forgery. Right? There are already people now who say that the scriptures were written hundreds of years after Christ's death, and as a political agenda that was being pushed by Constantine. That's not true either. But it doesn't do that. So they actually help to prove the historical reliability of the Gospels. So in order to understand how this works, we first need to kind of understand how this information is compiled. So there are many extra biblical, that means outside of scripture, there are many sources of writings um, around the time that the gospel events took place, within a couple hundred years, maybe before or after. Um, and when we look at all those writings and compile all the names that we find in those writings, we get a spread of names. This includes the Gospels as well, but there's like 2,500 names in this lexicon, I think, something like that. But we get a spread of names that existed during that time period and in that place. Um, Kind of think of it like if you took all of the names from like 1950, so things that were written like just after 1950, about 1950, and you would get names like, Donna and Patricia and Kenneth and Edward and Cynthia, names that your grandparents have. Meanwhile, when things are written, in 10 years about children today, you're going to get names like Aurora and Paisley and Leo and Miles and Braxton, or anything with an XTON ending, because those names are crazy popular. And the reason is because people today have different different names that they name their child than people in 1950 did. Um, and it's not just true of time periods, it's also true of places. So think about all the names that I just listed, and then cast your mind over to the Middle East, where you're going to find a lot different popular names. Like Abdul is a really popular name in the Middle East, and Aisha is a very popular name in the Middle East. And you're not going to find a lot of Braxtons in the Middle East, and you're not going to find a ton of Abdul or Aishas here. Um, so the point is, you can tell with a certain amount of confidence when and where an event took place just by looking at a certain spread of names. You can also tell if that event that they're saying took place at that time actually did, based on that spread of names that you have. So if the Gospels are historical, then they should point towards the times and places that the names would have been used. The Gospels, the names that the Gospels have been used in should point towards, you know, Jerusalem in the mid first century, right? Well, early to mid first century, because that's when the Gospels were written. From well, they not when they were written, but when the Gospel events took place, like 30 A.D. to, you know, 70 A.D. or whenever 60 A.D. whenever the Book of Acts was finished being written. Um, so specifically, I'm talking about, like, some names, like I said before, some names are used multiple times in the Gospels. Like, if we look at that time period, John should be a popular name, right? James should be a popular name. Um, and then there are names that are only used once, or even like there are some names that are used of people that are higher up or royalty, like Herod, and a lot of times those types of names will be different than names that are used of common folk, and we want to see that too. So the most popular names in the Bible should line up with the most popular names that existed around that time period. And this is true. This is what we see. So there's a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham, and he takes, this is just part of the book, but he takes the names that are found at that time in, in all of the writings at that time. Like I said, I think it's about 2,500 names. And he compares those names to the names in the Bible, and they align very well. Which is kind of crazy, and I'll explain why. But there are some people that'll say, "Oh, this kind of comparison doesn't work um, because there aren't enough names in the Gospels and Acts," or they say, "Oh, well, they just used Josephus, who was a popular ancient historian that wrote during the first 6 centuries." Um, they say, oh, Josephus, they just took the names from Josephus and put those into scripture just using Josephus. However, there is a fairly large spread of names. If you take any writings during that time period, any writings at all, really, you're not going to get a much larger spread of names than you get in the Gospels and Acts specifically. And this also includes many repeated names, right? If you're writing a historical fiction, there's not a lot of books that you'll read or movies that you'll watch that have a ton of repeating names, because that gets confusing. And if you're trying to write a good historical fiction, you're going to try to make it as less confusing as you possibly can, right? You want to take the confusing knob and turn it down to one if you can. But we do see these repeating names in scripture. And even if the writers had access to Josephus, like it's claimed that, oh, they based it all off Josephus, even if they did have access to Josephus, um, it's not enough to obtain the degree of accuracy that they do obtain. So there was actually a test done. I forgot who did it, unfortunately, but there was a test done um, with all the different writings where all the naming data was compiled, um, and compared to general population, and given a percentage of likelihood that the specific name spread of those writings existed at that time and in that place. This is a gross oversimplification of the calculation that was actually done, but I'm too dumb to understand the math, and I'm just trying to get the across the gist of the calculation. So they take the names that are in one writing, and they compare that to the names of the general population at that time, and they say, how likely is it that this grouping of names that occurs in this writings occurred during this time period and in this place. So there are a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there are some historical fictions that take place and are set around the time and place during the same time as the Gospels, right? And when we take a look at the likelihood that that spread of names occurred at that time, it is less than 1 percentage point. I think it's like 0.00000. I think there's like 11 zeros and then a 1. So 0.00011 times 1%. That those names would have occurred during that time. So these are people writing historical novels, historical fiction novels, and the naming pattern that they have is very, very, very unlikely to have occurred. You have a better chance winning the lottery than that those names occurred in that spread during that time. Even when we look at Josephus's writings, so the historian Josephus that I was talking about earlier, um, the likelihood that the naming spread that occurred in his writings actually happened is 7%. Now that's astronomically higher than the historical fictions, so there's a certain degree of accuracy that we have there, that we can say Josephus is historical, but it's only 7% likely. However, when we look at the Gospels and Acts and the naming spread that happened in there, they are 85% likely. 85%. There's nothing else that occurs in this time and place that is anywhere near that likely of a naming spread. So this means that there's an 85% chance that the mix of names in Scripture would have occurred during the time of Jesus. That's kind of crazy. Now, one of the things about Josephus, because I think that Josephus is a good historian. I've read some of his stuff. Usually, it's just like references to his stuff and other things that I read. But Josephus was a historian, so he wrote a lot about like higher ups in society, kings, things like that, things that you want to put down in history. Whereas, so that's going to make it a little bit less likely that all those names occurred at a given time in that naming spread. Whereas the Gospels kind of gave um, gave an overview, right? There are a lot of people that Jesus talks to. The disciples, they're not higher ups in society, they're not kings, they're not politicians, they're fishermen. So we get a much bigger spread of the general population as opposed to just the higher ups. But keep in mind, pretty much all non Christian scholars believe that Josephus is historically accurate for the most part. I don't know of a scholar that does not believe that Josephus is historically accurate. And however, the naming spread in Josephus is many, many more times less likely to have occurred than the naming spread in the gospel. It is much more likely that the naming spread in the gospel occurred in history during that time and place than the naming spread in Josephus. Um, so that's kind of crazy, right? These people take Josephus to be historically accurate, and yet naming wise, the Bible is 10 times, over 10 times more accurate than Josephus is. Um, and I think that maybe this doesn't have the punch that it should. But think about having to write a historical fiction about 1980s Canada, and you don't have access to the internet, and the only thing that you can use and that you have access to is a limited amount of writings around that time period. The names that you would use in your writings would be nowhere near accurate enough to come anywhere near even 1 percentage point. They would not be anywhere near close to the actual naming spread of people in Canada in the 1980s. You wouldn't get close to it. The only way that the gospel writers could have achieved the accuracy in the naming pattern that they did is if they were really writing about real people and these people actually existed in history. So that's about it. A little bit of a shorter video, but this is great evidence that points towards the historical reliability of the Gospels that I think everyone can wrap their head around. We don't have to get into, Q and the different um, the different gospel writers and when they wrote and what they had access to and who they were writing about and who wrote the gospels, right? That's all super in-depth stuff. But this naming pattern um, evidence is really easy to wrap our mind around, and it is absolutely phenomenal evidence for the historical reliabilities of the gospel. So, if you got any other questions about that stuff, let me know. But yeah, that's about it.